Welcome, everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I'm going to give you just a moment to connect to audio here. All right. Welcome to this first Friday lecture for the month of May 2026. Our speaker today is Basic Program Instructor and the Graham School's Director of Academics, so Zoë Eisenman. Zoe's lecture is entitled Historians Made Elsewhere Than at Rome, Polybius and Josephus on the Roman Empire. This First Friday lecture is supported by the Anastopoulos Lecture Series Fund in memory of Basic Program Instructor George Anastopoulos. I am Noah Shafitz. I am the Cyril O'Hoole Chair of the Basic Program. You should know that this presentation is being recorded so that we can make it available on the Graham School YouTube channel. During the lecture and during the question and answer period that follows it, you will be unable to unmute your microphones, but we invite you to enter questions for Zoe into the chat box on Zoom at any time during today's event. And once Zoe finishes her lecture, she'll have a chance to respond to your questions. During the lecture, Zoe and I will be unable to see all but a handful of your video feeds. So you can turn your video on, you can turn it off, it's up to you. Zoe's video will be spotlighted during the lecture. Um, as a result, I will invite you now to select speaker view to view the lecture rather than gallery view. Um, Before I give Zoe a full introduction, let me tell you a little about the basic program and the Graham School of Continuing Liberal and Professional Studies at the University of Chicago. So, along with the basic program, the Graham School offers an array of programming, including our Masters of Liberal Arts program and our open enrollment courses, as well as a number of events and travel study opportunities. Since 1946, or coming up on 80 years in the fall, the basic program has offered students a rigorous education in the liberal arts through direct engagement with original texts and discussion-based courses led by highly dedicated instructors. At the heart of the basic program is our four-year course sequence, which offers first-hand encounters with some of the greatest works of the classical and Western traditions in a community of adult learners. Our next First Friday lecture will take place on June 5th. Our speaker will be Basic Program Instructor Joe Alulis, and the title of Joe's lecture will be The Charter of Democracy, Lincoln, the Declaration of Independence, and the Role of Statesmanship. Today's speaker, Zoë Eisenman, started teaching in the basic program in 1992. She served as the Cyril O'Hoole Chair from 2015 to 2020. Zoe has a BA in Greek from Vassar College, go Brewers, and an MA in Classics from the University of Chicago, where she has also done advanced graduate work. Zoe's main academic focus is on Greek and Roman history and philosophy, on classical cultural history, and in gender studies. She has taught in the college at the University of Chicago and in the philosophy department at St. Xavier University. She is the 2014 recipient of the Graham School's Excellence in Teaching Award for the basic program, and she is currently, as I mentioned, the Director of Academics at the Graham School. All right, without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn things over to Zoe. Zoe, go ahead, please.
Great. Thanks, Noah. Hi, everybody. Let me get my PowerPoint going here. Okay, hopefully everybody can see that. And get my windows sorted out. So, all right. Thank you for coming today. I'd like to dedicate today's lecture to my father, Stanley Eisenman, who always supported me, and wanted to just bring him up here, say thank you. So my talk is called Historians Made Elsewhere Than at Rome, Polybius and Josephus on the Roman Empire. It's sort of an inside joke on the idea of Tacitus' quip about emperors made elsewhere than at Rome. But this focus is going to be on where these guys are from. So we've all heard the adage, history is written by the winners. And so in this talk, I'm going to actually discuss history that was written by the losers, two historians of Rome that started off as leaders of countries that were ultimately conquered by the Romans. I'll begin by giving a brief biographical overview of the historians, Polybius and Josephus. I'll discuss the way they approach history writing and the similarities that they show despite coming from different eras and ethnic traditions. And then finally, I'll examine the way that both of these historians portray Roman power and empire, and how this can give us a different insight into the history of their times than historians who were from Rome. So let's start off with Polybius. Polybius was born around 200 BC into an aristocratic Greek family from the city of Megalopolis in Arcadia, which was founded in the 4th century BC, and which at that time was the principal city of the Achaean League. Now, for Greece at this time and the Mediterranean world, this area of the Mediterranean was dominated by the Hellenistic kingdoms that had formed after the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BC. So get you the map there. Yeah, you can sort of see on the map where these places were. The Kingdom of Macedonia in the northern part of Greece dominated the rest of the peninsula through alliances and military force. Egypt, which doesn't show up on this map, but is down on the south there, was the major power in the southern end of the Mediterranean, butting up against Carthage in the west, and then the Seleucids in the east. The mainland of Greece was divided up into various states and leagues that were constantly fighting each other with the aid of the big powers. Rome had gotten involved with Greece after the Macedonian king Pyrrhus invaded Italy and was defeated in 275 BC. During the years leading up to the Macedonian Wars, Rome had been gradually extending her influence eastward around the Adriatic coast. Okay. Yeah, here's a map of the expansion of the Roman Republic in this time period. Polybius's father, Lycurgus, was a friend and supporter of Philopoemen, the heroic general of the Achaean League. These are all sort of Hellenistic generals, guys. The Achaean League grew to dominate central Greece during the First Macedonian War with Rome, which was in 214 to 205 BC, and during conflicts with the dictator Nabis of Sparta and the Aetolians. They were allied with the Romans during the Second Macedonian War in 198 to 197, and between Philopoemen's efforts and Roman support, the Achaean League effectively ended Sparta's reign as military and political power in 188 BC. Lycurgus served as strategos, which is the general-in-chief of the League, in 184, and Polybius followed in his father's footsteps. In his youth, he served with the Romans in the campaign of 189 against the Gauls in Asia Minor, and he was the hipparchus, or cavalry commander, of the Achaean League for 169 to 168, which marked him as next in line for the role of strategos. Polybius was brought up with the expectation of and training for a career as a general and political leader of the Achaean League, and he was also collaborating and negotiating with the Romans during this period. Polybius seems to have advocated that in order to maintain any semblance of independence and freedom, the Greek states needed to acknowledge Roman dominance in the region and to make sure to stay on their good side in any disputes. This meant walking a fine line between advocating for his own Achaean League in Greek affairs while being deferential to the Romans as they expanded their influence. During the Third Macedonian War, 172 to 168, this balance became extremely tricky. When the defeat of King Perseus of Macedon eliminated Macedon as a power, the Romans cracked down on any Greeks they suspected of less than enthusiastic support of their policies, and different factions gained power by accusing their enemies of disloyalty. As a result, 1,000 Achaean leaders were sent to Rome to be tried for opposition to the Roman regime, and Polybius was one of them. These Achaeans were never actually tried, but were kept at Rome as hostages to forestall any rebellion, and they were not allowed to leave for 16 years. Polybius was actually pretty lucky. He had become friends with the general Lucius Aemilius Paulus during the Macedonian Wars, and Paulus arranged for him to remain in Rome at his house and act as a tutor for his sons. Polybius became particularly close to the younger son, who was to become eventually, by adoption, Publius Scipio Aemilianus Africanus the Younger. Through Aemilius, Polybius became part of the Scipionic philosophic and literary circle that was started in Rome by Publius Scipio Africanus the Elder, the victory over Hannibal at Zama, a group that included many of the leading Romans of the time. This gave Polybius an insider view of Roman politics despite his foreign origin. Polybius became the trusted advisor of Publius Scipio Aemilianus Africanus the Younger during the Third Punic War and the Numantine War in Spain. Despite being allowed to return to Greece in 150, he seems to have stayed in Scipio's service and followed around with him. And in 146 BC, he was with him when he sacked the city of Carthage, ending that last Punic War, the Third Punic War. And that meant that he avoided the bloody conflict that was happening in Greece at the same time, which ultimately resulted in the sacking of Corinth that same year, and the final subjugation of Greece to Rome as a province. On his return to Greece, he served as an intermediary between the Romans and the Greeks from 146 to 144 BC, helping to reorganize the new provincial governments there. He died around 118 BC, allegedly after a fall from a horse at the age of 82. His work, the Histories, covers the period from 264 to 146 BC, describing the growth of Rome into the dominant power in the Mediterranean through the conquest of Macedon, Greece, and Carthage. So that's sort of an overview of him. And now I would like to turn to Josephus. So my other historian is Josephus, also known as Flavius Josephus, also known as Joseph ben Mattiyahu. He's got a bunch of different types of names. Josephus was born nearly 200 years after Polybius, somewhere around 37 CE, in Jerusalem, which at that point was part of the province of Judea. Judea, let's get my map here. Okay. Had been constantly involved in conflicts between the Hellenistic kingdoms that I talked about earlier, mostly being controlled by the Seleucids over in Asia Minor, over here, this area. The Hellenistic influence in the region resulted in internal conflicts between traditional Jewish and Hellenizing factions in Judea. And in 167 BC, the Seleucid king Antiochus IV Epiphanes tried to enforce Greek religious practices on the Jews, which resulted in the revolt led by Judas Maccabee and his brothers. This successful revolt not only inaugurated the festival of Hanukkah, but it established the Maccabees as the rulers of Judea, founding the Hasmonean dynasty. Judea was able to keep its independence as a kingdom, despite Rome's conquests of the other Hellenistic kingdoms, up until 63 BC, when Pompey and his Roman army were called in to try to resolve a succession dispute between two brothers who were rival claimants to the throne. This devolved into a war and a siege of Jerusalem. Pompey's forces took the city and desecrated the temple, but ultimately left, reinstating the victorious brother as high priest, but not king, only ethnarch. So that was a downgrade. Judea had to pay tribute. It lost its coastal territory and was subject to oversight by the Roman administration in the new province of Syria. Many of the Jews fled to the Parthian Empire, over here in the east here, which didn't impose religious rules on them, and to Alexandria, where there had always been a large Jewish community. In 41 BC, Mark Antony appointed Herod the Great, who you may have heard of, as one of the tetrarchs, the three governors of Judea. And in 40 or 39 BC, the Senate made him king of Judea. Herod successfully recaptured Jerusalem with Roman help in 37 BC and continued to rule with Roman support until his death in 4 BC. Dynastic chaos ensued, and the Romans intervened, putting Judea under direct Roman rule. Except for a brief reign by Herod's grandson, Agrippa I, from 41 to 44 CE, Judea was now ruled by Rome. Josephus was from a priestly family, and on his mother's side claimed descent from the Hasmonean royal family, which ruled Judea. When he was 26, Josephus was part of an embassy to Rome, where he successfully petitioned the Emperor Nero for the release of some captive Jewish priests. When he returned to Judea, he was appointed military governor of Galilee by the revolutionary government, because the revolution had already started by then, and was responsible for recruiting, training, and leading an army during the First Jewish War, when the Jews rebelled against Roman control. Despite his efforts at fortifying the towns in the area and some initial successes, he was unable to hold out against the Roman army under Vespasian. After being besieged in Jotapata in 67 CE, he surrendered after most of his remaining compatriots had committed suicide. He was taken by Vespasian as a slave, and he became a confidant to the general and his son Titus after prophesying that Vespasian would become emperor. When Vespasian indeed did become emperor in 69 CE, the last survivor of the year of four emperors, okay, the four emperors slave. No, not yet. I don't. Okay, I'll come to that later. He granted Josephus his freedom, and Josephus followed the Roman freedman custom by taking the name Flavius. So he got that from the Flavian emperor, and he received Roman citizenship. Josephus became a military advisor to Vespasian's son Titus, who was in command of the Roman forces in Judea, during the war, also serving as a translator and occasional envoy. He shows up as a character in his own book quite a bit. He witnessed Titus' siege and conquest of Jerusalem, which resulted in the destruction of the Second Temple and the razing of the city. In 71 CE, he went with Titus to Rome, where he stayed on as a client of the Flavians and wrote his extant works. Much of his history of the Jewish war was written within 10 years of the events it covers. The date of his death is uncertain, but is thought to be around 100 CE, because of evidence in the text. So that's a little bit of background about both of these historians. Now that you have a little bit of sense of who they are and where they're coming from, I'm going to talk a little bit more about their histories. So starting with Polybius, Polybius starts his history off with a clear statement of his purpose. He says, the study of history is at once an education in the truest sense and a training for a political career, and that the most infallible, indeed the only method of learning how to bear with dignity the vicissitudes of fortune is to be reminded of the disasters suffered by others. He then goes on to say, there can surely be nobody so petty or so apathetic in his outlook that he has no desire to discover by what means and under what system of government the Romans succeeded in less than 53 years in bringing under their rule almost the whole of the inhabited world, an achievement which is without parallel in human history. These two statements tell us much about his outlook on history and his intended audience. Writing in Greek, Polybius's primary audience is other Greeks who are aiming for a political career and would need to learn the lessons he's offering on how to deal with the Roman hegemony, as is indicated in the second quote. He speaks directly to this question of audience. Let's see here. When he says, now, were we Greeks well acquainted with the two states which disputed the empire of the world, that being Carthage and Rome, it would not perhaps have been necessary for me to deal at all with their previous history, or to narrate what purpose guided them, or on what sources of strength they relied in entering upon such a vast undertaking. But as neither the former power nor the earlier history of Rome and Carthage is familiar to most of us Greeks, I thought it necessary to preface this book and the next to the actual history, in order that no one, after becoming engrossed in the narrative proper, may find himself at a loss, and ask by what counsel, and trusting to what power and resources, the Romans embarked on that enterprise which has made them lords over land and sea in our part of the world. But that from these books and the preliminary sketch in them, it may be clear to readers that they had quite adequate grounds for conceiving the ambition of a world empire, and adequate means for achieving their purpose. So that's addressing the Greeks and talking about why he's talking to that audience. But Polybius also has lessons for the Roman aristocracy as well. Greek was the language of culture and education for upper class Romans during Polybius's time, and especially for the Scipionic circle, where discussions about Greek philosophy and poetry were among their main activities. Certainly, Polybius is hoping that these educated Romans will find the lessons in his text that will help them to be good rulers of their newly acquired empire. And an example of this can be found in Book 9, when he's criticizing the looting of Syracuse by the Romans. He says, there were indeed perhaps good reasons for appropriating all the gold and silver, for it was impossible for them to aim at world empire without weakening the resources of other peoples and strengthening their own. But it was possible for them to leave everything which did not contribute to such strength, together with the envy attached to its possession, in its original place, and to add to the glory of their native city by adorning it not with paintings and reliefs, but with dignity and magnanimity. At any rate, these remarks will serve to teach all those who succeed to empire that they should not strip cities under the idea that the misfortunes of others are an ornament to their own country. So again, in terms of audience, we see that he's both thinking about the Greeks and his compatriots, but also these Roman aristocrats. All right. Josephus also begins his history with a lengthy statement of purpose. He starts off by saying, the war fought by the Jews against the Romans was not only the greatest war of our time, but could well be one of the greatest collisions between states or nations of which word has come down to us. He goes on to say that there were two kinds of historians who have written about the conflict. People who are not involved, who create a mishmash of incoherent stories, or people who were involved, but who, quote, distort the facts either to flatter the Romans or out of hatred for the Jews, unquote. Josephus claims to be writing in response to these bad historians. quote, when Parthians, Babylonians in deepest Arabia and my compatriots in Mesopotamia and Adiabene had, thanks to my own efforts, accurate information about the origin of the war, its painful progress, and its conclusion, it seemed intolerable that the Greeks and those Romans not involved in the campaign should remain ignorant of the facts and treated to nothing more than partisan flattery or pure fiction. He continues, it is certainly not my intention to counter this Roman bias with an equally tendentious account in favor of my compatriots. I shall record the actions of both sides with strict impartiality, but my comments on the events will owe something to my own situation, and I shall allow my personal sympathies the expression of sorrow at the fate that befell my country. So this introduction explains why he was writing in Greek, despite presenting himself as an historian of the Jewish people. He aligns himself with the Greek historical tradition that starts with Thucydides, to which Polybius also subscribed, writing about contemporary events, things to which he was an eyewitness, and striving for accuracy and truth on a subject that is worthy of posterity's attention. In addition to claiming that the war was the greatest of our time, he also claims that the Jews suffered the biggest tragedy. Of all the cities in the Roman Empire, ours was the one to reach the greatest heights of prosperity and then plummet to the lowest depths of misery. In fact, looking over the whole sweep of history, I would say that the sufferings of the Jews have been greater than those of any other nation, and no foreign power is to blame. More about that later. Perhaps Josephus also hoped to soften some of the anti-Jewish sentiment prevalent among Romans after the war, and to encourage the Romans to have a similar attitude toward the Jews that the Romans of Polybius' time had toward the Greeks, viewing them as a conquered but valiant people with much to offer Rome. So both of these historians are writing in Greek, following this Hellenic tradition, historical tradition in general, and Thucydides in particular, and claim to value eyewitness accounts as well as practical experience in war and politics over armchair history. They both call on their own experiences as politicians and generals quite often. Josephus may have modeled his historical approach specifically on Polybius, since he mentions him in several places in his account. It is possible that Josephus takes some of his approach to the Romans from Polybius as well. Both writers are at pains to present themselves as patriots who love their country, but who saw the writing on the wall when it came to taking sides against the Romans. And they both give similar reasons for the wars and their outcomes. The revolt of the Achaean League in 147 to 46 BC and that of the Jews in 69 and 70 through 71 CE both took place at times when Rome seemed to have other bigger problems to deal with. For the Achaean League, their revolt came during the Third Punic War, when Rome had just been in a major war with Spain and was engaged in war with Carthage. To the Greeks, who were chafing under the authority of Rome and still thought of themselves as comparable powers, it might have seemed like a good opportunity to throw off the Roman yoke. For the Jews, the chaos caused by the civil wars over the succession of Nero's suicide in 69 might have looked like the end of the United Roman Empire. I think I have a chart. Yeah, here's chart timelines here. If four different emperors had divided up the territory, as looked likely to happen, perhaps Judea could win its independence while the Romans were busy fighting each other. So it seemed plausible that these might be opportune moments to break away. However, neither Polybius nor Josephus emphasize or believe that there was a realistic opportunity to break free of Rome. Instead, both writers blame the leaders of the respective revolts, characterizing them as irrational, greedy for personal wealth and power, and destructive to their own people due to their delusions. When Polybius talks about the leaders who took the Achaean League into war with Rome, he is uniformly critical. He starts off in his account in Book 38 with a disclaimer. Some, however, may reproach me for writing with undue animosity, it being rather my first duty to throw a veil over the offenses of the Greeks. In times of danger, it is true that those who are Greeks should help the Greeks in every way by active support, by cloaking faults, and by trying to appease the anger of the ruling power, as I myself actually did at the time of the occurrences. But the literary record of the events, meant for posterity, should be kept free from any taint of falsehood, so that instead of the ears of readers being agreeably tickled for the present, their minds may be reformed in order to avoid falling more than once into the same errors. He certainly follows through with this approach in his account. He admits that some of the escalating tension was the fault of the Romans. They were seen as being too haughty and strict in their treatment of the Greeks, as they had been with the Carthaginians. And he highlights their policy of dividing their allies as well as their enemies, and favoring whoever suited their own interests. The Achaean League had allied with Rome against Macedon, but Rome had been blocking its attempts to expand control over the whole of the Peloponnese. When the League attacked and conquered Sparta in 148 BC, the Romans sent envoys to threaten the League with retaliation if they didn't stop their efforts. Let's see. And Polybius tries to put the Romans' harshness in the best possible light. So he says, quote, having for so long acknowledged the League and regarded it as the most loyal of the Greek powers, they sought fit to alarm the Achaeans and curb their undue arrogance, but by no means wished to go to war with them or proceed to an absolute rupture. So again, downplaying their aggressive actions. Some of the Achaean leaders advised the League to stand down and not antagonize the Romans, advice which Polybius presents in a positive way. On getting this advice, all the wiser people gladly accepted the advice, conscious as they were of their error, and having before their eyes the fate that awaited those who opposed Rome. But the majority, while having nothing to say against the just strictness of Sextus, the Roman envoy, and being obliged to keep silence, yet remained ill-conditioned and demoralized. And Deius and Critolaus, they were the leaders of the revolt, and all who shared their views, and these were, so to speak, a deliberate selection from each city of the worst men, the most God-forsaken, and the greatest corrupters of the nation, led on the unhappy nation to adopt the mistaken policy they had set their hearts on. What else could be expected when those in power were so ignorant and ill-disposed? So again, a very harsh view of these leaders. And then when the Romans sent a delegation to try to calm the situation to avoid war, he accuses Critolaus of whipping up the crowd against them. The people, on listening to them, the Romans, showed no disposition to comply, but jeered at the legates, hooted and hustled them out of the meeting. For never had there been collected such a pack of rough-handed and common men. All the towns, indeed, were in a driveling state, but the malady was universal and most fierce at Corinth. Critolaus, he says, continued to fan the flames, accusing anyone who didn't agree of being a collaborator and getting himself voted as strategos with absolute power. Polybius concludes his assessment of Critolaus by saying, Critolaus then, having carried through these measures, set himself to intrigue against and attack the Romans, not listening to reason, but forming projects which outraged the laws of gods and man. So fairly harsh critique there. And then in the last fragment of Book 38, Polybius details the violence that the leaders of the revolts perpetrated on their own people. And he concludes that Greece was actually lucky that the Romans conquered it, despite the total destruction of Corinth. He says, for it is evident from the analogy of the League leaders' previous conduct, such as I have described it, how they would have probably acted against their own people if they had any opportunity or achieved any success. Everybody, in fact, kept repeating the proverb, had we not perished so soon, we never would have been saved. So ultimately, Polybius is much more critical of the revolutionary leaders than of the Romans and lays the blame for the war squarely on those leaders. Turning to Josephus, in his early books, Josephus seems to be even much more critical of the Romans. He calls out the harsh treatment of the Jews by inept and greedy Roman procurators, especially under Caligula and Nero, listing their offenses and detailing the terror that they inflicted on the Jews unjustly. He accuses the procurator Florus of deliberately trying to provoke a war so that he could loot the province, saying his object had always been to get his hands on God's treasures, and that's why he was so keen to force his way in. And then Florus now deployed another tactic to induce a state of war. So he's constantly trying to provoke people and from greed and corruption here. He describes Florus as escalating the oppression, killing thousands of men, women, and children. And, quote, what made the tragedy yet harder to bear was the unprecedented brutality of the Romans. On that day, Florus went further than any of his predecessors by having men of equestrian rank publicly flogged and nailed to the cross. They may have been Jews by birth, but even so, they did have the rights of Roman citizenship. So this is coming on the heels of a really horrific description of massacring civilians. So this last comment is clearly meant to elicit sympathy from his Roman readers, pointing out the citizenship. But alongside this harsh view of the Romans in the first part of the history, Josephus' depiction of the leaders of the revolt is overwhelmingly negative. He categorizes two of the main factions of the revolt, the Sicarii and the Zealots, as robbers and bandits, calling their armies gangs that rampaged against their own people. The charlatans and the terrorists joined forces to incite large numbers to revolt. They encouraged the fight for independence by threatening death to anyone who kowtowed to the dictates of Roman rule, and proclaiming that those who preferred their slavery would have freedom forced on them. With separate units sent out to cover the country, they ransacked the estates of the powerful, murdered the owners, burnt their villages. Ultimately, the whole of Judea was infected by this crazy campaign, and it was a war which every passing day fanned into a greater flame. So again, the Sicarii are often described as terrorists and assassins. The Zealots are depicted as more concerned with establishing their own power internally than with defeating the Romans, so constantly fighting against their fellow Jews. Both are accused of ultimately causing more damage to the Jews because of their infighting than the Romans did. Rather than seeing any rational justification for their revolt and the way they carried it out, Josephus talks about them as hungry for power and riches and willing to put their own people to the sword to get them. Oh, something about the dogs there. Some of his critiques seem self-serving, since Josephus himself was one of the generals feuding with these factions, and he was trying to keep his own authority during all the infighting. But it does seem that many of the factions were willing to murder their political rivals and whoever else got in the way when they got the opportunity. Talking about the two factions holding Jerusalem, Josephus, John, and Simon were the leaders. Josephus says, in the war between these two rival factions, as we have said, the losses either way were the ordinary citizens, and that whole section of the community which refused to take any accessory role in their crimes suffered the depredations of both parties. So why were Polybius and Josephus both so sure that a revolt against the Romans would not succeed? I mean, they blamed their compatriots for starting these revolts with no chance of success. Both of them seem to look at Roman conquests and domination as unstoppable. And one reason that they both give for this is the power of the Roman legions. So both Polybius and Josephus have similar respect and admiration for the Roman army, despite writing 200 years apart. They both praise Roman military technology, whether it is in using special formations, adopting successful weapons or tactics from the enemy, or creating and using machinery in sieges and assaults. Polybius compares Roman formations favorably to the powerhouse of the previous generation, the Macedonian phalanx. For every Roman soldier, once he is armed and sets about his business, can adapt himself equally well to every place and time, and can meet attack from every quarter. He is likewise equally prepared and equally in condition, whether he has to fight together with the whole army, or with a part of it, or in maniples, or singly. So in all particulars, the Romans are much more serviceable. Since in all particulars the Romans are much more serviceable, Roman plans are much more apt to result in success than those of others. But it is the discipline and the diligence of the Roman army that most impress them. Polybius remarks that, unlike most states of his time, the Romans are always training and keep soldiers in service even when they aren't actively involved in a major war. In his book 6, Polybius describes the Roman military organization of his time in great detail. He uses the set plan of the Roman camp as an example of consistency, in which every soldier knows his job and his literal place, keeping order even when at rest. Polybius was especially impressed by the methods by which the Romans kept discipline through a system of punishments and rewards. Punishment for cowardice involves flogging and disgrace for an individual and decimation for larger groups. This harsh punishment is balanced with rewards. The general calls an assembly of the troops and bringing forward those whom he considers to have displayed conspicuous valor, first of all speaks in laudatory terms of the courageous deeds of each and of anything else in their previous conduct which deserves commendation, and afterwards distributes rewards. By such incentives they excite to emulation and rivalry in the field, not only the men who are present and listen to their words, but those who remain at home also. For the recipients of such gifts, quite apart from being famous in the army, and famous too at the time at their homes, are especially distinguished in religious processions after their return. Considering all this attention given to matters of punishments and rewards in the army, and the importance attached to both, no wonder that the wars in which the Romans engage end so successfully and brilliantly. Similarly, Josephus also praises the military diligence and discipline of the Romans. Looking more generally at their military organization, one will recognize that the vast empire they possess is the prize of their courageous endeavor, not the gift of fortune. They do not wait for an actual war to commence their training in arms. No question of sitting on their hands in peacetime and only stirring themselves when emergencies necessitate action. On the contrary, they are virtually born to arms and never give themselves a truce from military training or simply wait on circumstances. Their exercises are just as tough as the real thing, and every soldier applies himself to the daily drill with all the energy you would show on the battlefield. That is why they take the strain of battle so calmly. No indiscipline breaking their regular formation, no panic spooking them, no fatigue exhausting their effort, and against opponents not so trained, the constant and inevitable result is victory. It would not be an exaggeration to describe their training exercises as bloodless battles and their battles as bloody drills. Both Polybius and Josephus seem convinced that such a disciplined fighting force, fed by a seemingly unlimited supply of manpower, would inevitably defeat even the bravest freedom fighters from their much smaller countries. Josephus lays out the harsh reality in the speech of King Agrippa when he's trying to dissuade the Jews from revolt. As he says, as for this passion for freedom which you now profess, it comes too late. You should have fought long ago not to lose your freedom in the first place. Slavery is a painful experience, and any fight to avoid entertaining that state is justified. But once subjected, those who then try to break away are insolent slaves, not lovers of freedom. So the time when you should have done everything possible to keep out the Romans was when Pompey was invading the country. But our forefathers and their kings, despite financial, physical, and moral resources far greater than yours, failed to resist a small fraction of the Roman army. Are you then, after generations of subject status, so ill-equipped in comparison with those who made that original submission? Are you going to defy the whole Roman Empire? He goes on to enumerate the many formidable enemies that the Romans have defeated, saying, are you richer than the Gauls? Stronger than the Germans? Cleverer than the Greeks? More numerous than everyone else in the world? What gives you the confidence to set yourselves against the Romans? So, in addition to the military might of Rome and this seemingly unconquerable power of the legions, both Polybius and Josephus attribute some of Rome's success in conquering to a larger plan by a higher power. In Polybius's introduction, he justifies his plan to tell world history rather than local history by showing how fortune has guided almost all the affairs of the world in one direction and has forced them to incline toward one and the same end. I therefore thought it quite necessary not to leave unnoticed or to allow to pass into oblivion this finest and most beneficent of the performances of fortune. For though she is ever producing something new and ever playing a part of the lives of men, she has not in a single instance ever accomplished such a work, ever achieved such a triumph as in our own times. Again, talking about the Romans' conquest of the Mediterranean in 50 years. This would seem to set up fortune as the main driver in Roman success. However, Polybius tries to distinguish between regular cause and effect, which are explainable by human reason, and things that are out of the ordinary, which we can only explain as some divine action. For the most part, the Romans' military successes he relates have normal explanations of cause and effect, especially given their organization, training, and political structure. The work of fortune seems to be in the long arc of Rome's rise to power, with the corollary that at some point they will decline again, as is the pattern with those that fortune favors. In Josephus' case, he sees the Romans as the instrument of God's punishments for the sins of his people. He lays this framework for this theme in the early sections of the history as he describes the crimes of the Hasmonean dynasts as well as those of other Jewish factions, but he really starts to emphasize it at the point of his surrender to Vespasian. And in this famous passage, after his defeat, Josephus is hiding in a cave with his men, trying to avoid capture. The other men want to kill themselves rather than surrender. But, quote, Josephus found himself reliving those dreams he had had at night, in which God had forewarned him of the disasters in store for the Jews and foretold the future of the Roman Principate. The interpretation of dreams was one of his skills, and he was adept at deducing the true meaning of ambiguous divine communications. And as a priest himself, descended from a line of priests, he was familiar with the prophecies of the sacred books. At that critical moment, all of this came clear to him in a flash of inspiration. And drawing further on the terrifying images of his recent dreams, he offered up a prayer to God under his breath. Since it is your will, he prayed, to bring to its knees the Jewish nation which you created, since all good fortune has now passed over to the Romans, and since you have singled out my spirit to foretell what is to come, I now choose to surrender myself to the Romans and to live. But I call you to witness that I go not as a traitor, but as your servant. Now, this is clearly Josephus trying to justify his own actions and saving himself and going over to the enemy there. But as his narrative progresses, he repeatedly points out instances where the Jewish leaders of the rebels are being sacrilegious or criminal, and notes that God would punish the nations for their crimes. Given time, skip over a little bit here. So as Jerusalem was about to be taken, he writes, God was clouding their minds in punishment for their sins. They were blind to the reserves of Roman power, far greater than the section they had expelled, blind too to the famine that was creeping on them. From every corner of the earth, fortune had passed to the Romans, and God, who transfers dominion from one nation to the other, was now presiding over Italy. And then in his speech to the rebel leaders who've been using the temple as a fortress, to launch their attacks from. Josephus says, has God our creator ever failed to avenge the Jews if wrong is done to them? Turn around and contemplate the place where you made your headquarters for this war, the temple, and reflect what a mighty ally you've grossly abused. Think back on what our fathers were divinely helped to achieve and what tremendous wars this holy place has quashed for us in the past. He goes on to enumerate the times God saved them when they acted piously, accuses them of crimes of impiety, and then begs them to surrender and repent. And then during the famine that came along with the siege, some of the fighters started using the sacred wine and oil for the temple as food for the soldiers. And Josephus says, I believe that if the Romans had been slow to move against those sinners, either the earth would have opened up and swallowed the city, or would have been swept away by a flood, or the thunderbolts which destroyed Sodom would have struck again. The city had produced a generation far more godless than those afflicted by such catastrophes in the past. These were peoples whose madness involved the whole population in their ruin. He even depicts himself as getting into a shouting match with the rebel leader John, citing prophecy about the city's destruction. And he gives a rundown of all those prophecies later in Book 6, saying that God is using the Romans to punish the Jews similarly to the way he used Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians under Jeremiah. This comparison with Jeremiah suggests that God will eventually dispose of the Romans when he's done using them, just as he did with the Babylonians. So, like Polybius, Josephus seems to cling to the idea that no good fortune or empire lasts forever, and that the favor of fortune or God is going to run out eventually. In addition to their military capabilities and to divine will, both authors do talk to some extent about the virtues of the Romans that help make them successful. Polybius emphasized the virtues of duty and honor. Let's see. Whoops, that's too far. That inculcate Roman citizens with a desire for military glory. He cites the Roman funerary practice of parading the desk masks of one's ancestors along with military decorations and honors, saying that it inspires young men to endure the extremes of suffering for the common good in the hope of winning the glory that waits upon the brave. Polybius credits the Romans with being honest in money matters, not taking bribes, and with honoring their oaths and using religion to unify the people. He also thinks that the mixed political system of the Republic contributes to Roman success. In war, he says, quote, the consequence is that this peculiar form of constitution possesses an irresistible power to achieve any goal it has set itself. And in peace, no one element can become overbearing or abusive, since, quote, the designs of anyone can be blocked or impeded by the rest. While all these things sound fairly positive, Polybius contrasts these virtues with the way that the Romans treat allies and subjects. He consistently portrays them as considering their own advantage over any other considerations in their dealing with other states or regimes, rather than adhering to their professed friendships or obligations. He depicts Roman ambassadors provoking allies with outrageous demands in order to have a pretext for ending an alliance or taking punitive measures, and as playing nations off against each other for their own gain. He depicts the Senate as arrogant and self-serving rather than merciful, tolerant, or even fair. And there's a couple of examples where he advises people not to go to the Senate to ask for permission just to do things because they won't give you permission. Um, and then finally, there's the behavior of the Roman generals in capturing a city, particularly one that they consider to be, quote, in revolt, right? So Corinth, which had been previously granted perpetual freedom by Flamininus, who was celebrated by the Greeks, was looted and razed with no mercy shown to the inhabitants. Polybius relates that his protege Scipio, the victor at Carthage, wept to see the city razed to the ground, but did nothing to stop it. And his sorrow was not so much for the Carthaginians as it was thinking that one day that might also be Rome's fate. Polybius's theory of anacyclosis, or the cycle of regimes, also predicts that Rome is bound to become corrupt and fall. So the examples of a decline in virtue that Polybius gives should be warning signs to his Roman readers. Josephus, writing 200 years later under the empire, takes a dimmer view of Roman virtues. While bravery is still a virtue of the Roman soldier, he doesn't see much virtue in the upper levels of Roman government, especially under the earlier emperors. While he avoids criticizing Nero or Claudius directly, their officials are corrupt, violent, and vindictive, and the emperors are not receptive to complaints. His tone changes somewhat once Vespasian becomes emperor. Both Vespasian and Titus are praised as being smart and brave in their conduct of the war. Josephus even shows Titus as a heroic figure, fighting in the front lines with his troops despite the risk of being killed. There are echoes of Alexander the Great in his stories of Titus scaling city walls or fighting his way out after being cut off from his army. So bravery is certainly a virtue he sees on display. Josephus also tries very hard to ascribe the virtue of clementia, or clemency, to Titus. He consistently depicts Titus as encouraging the Jews to surrender so that he can avoid having to destroy them. In Josephus' own speech to the besieged rebels in Jerusalem as Titus' envoy, he claims that the Romans were lenient in victory. Even now, Caesar was prepared to offer them terms, but if he had to take the city by storm, he would not spare a single one of them, especially if they rejected his offers when facing the ultimate calamity. His claims of clemency for Titus are rather undercut by Titus' actions, however. While Titus receives some of the upper-class Jewish deserters with kindness, quote unquote, and allows them to resettle elsewhere, when famine in the besieged city leads many other Jews to try to escape, quote, they were scourged and put to every form of torture before death, then crucified in front of the wall. Titus himself was appalled at this punishment, as 500 and sometimes even more were captured every day. On the other hand, he recognized the risk of releasing prisoners of war and could see that keeping such large numbers under guard would effectively imprison the troops needed to guard them. But his main reason for not stopping the crucifixions was the hope that the sight of them would perhaps induce the Jews to surrender, for fear of suffering the same fate if they continued to resist. Now, this is rather unmerciful mercy, as you can see. Josephus also presents the burning of the temple as happening against Titus's orders, but then he says that, quote, Caesar ordered the army to raze to the ground the whole city and the temple, after allowing the soldiers to pillage the city. Clearly, Josephus is trying to present a positive view of his imperial patrons, but given the outcome, it's not very convincing. Ultimately, the best Josephus can manage is to present the Romans as the less terrible option. They are violent and impious, but not as violent and impious as the Jewish rebels, who are perpetrating these sins against their own people and their own religion. So, in conclusion, both Polybius and Josephus seem to place more blame for the destruction of their countries on the rebel leaders who start the war than they do on the Romans, even as they acknowledge that Roman behavior pushed their compatriots past their limits of tolerance. They downplay the idea that the revolts had any chance of succeeding against the vastly superior Roman army, and see some initial victories only as giving false hope to the rebels. While Polybius makes a case that the Roman political system and cultural customs are what gives the army its discipline and leads to its success, Josephus thinks that the legions have become a military machine at the command of the emperor, but it is still unstoppable. Both see divine will, whether fortune or God, as using the Romans for a larger purpose. But it is not due to any particular virtues or good on the part of the Romans, especially in terms of how they rule their subjects, but rather because of their ruthless efficiency in conquering others. And both historians cling to the hope that eventually the wheel will turn and that empire too will fall. But unfortunately, it will be too late for their countries. And as a brief postscript, I know I'm not a little over time, but I'd just like to quickly compare the reception of these two historians. Both of these historians in their histories were very influential on later writers. Livy uses Polybius extensively as a source in his books on the Punic Wars, and Josephus himself thought of Polybius as a predecessor. And Josephus was read by Tacitus and probably Suetonius, and in addition to Roman historians, he was a major source for early Christian historians and histories. And so, as historians, posterity among the Romans granted both of them significant credibility. Their reputations as members of the communities, however, varied considerably. Polybius, who was not actually part of the Achaean leadership or the Roman army when the Achaean League revolted, um, that helped him a little bit. Even, however, he was tasked with the Romans to manage the sort of cleanup operations when he returned to Greece. But since he used his influence to become a benefactor to the cities in Greece, he was celebrated by the Greeks for his public works, despite the fact that he was working for Rome. So there's a bunch of statues put up to Polybius throughout Greece during this time period, and we know some of the inscriptions on them. One from Lycosura reads, "Greece would never have come to grief had she obeyed Polybius in all things, and having come to grief, she found succor through him alone." And his epitaph at Megalopolis, his hometown, stated, "He had been the ally of the Romans and had quenched their anger against Greece." So pretty favorable reception by the Greeks of Polybius. Josephus, on the other hand, perhaps in part because of his active participation on the Roman side during the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, was reviled by his people. He never returned to Judea. He lived the rest of his life in Rome, and his histories were ignored by the rabbinic schools and other Jewish writers who considered him to be a traitor. And that's where I'll leave it. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Zoe. So we only have one question from the chat. Looks like a second one just came in, but I want to welcome everybody who's listening to add questions in the chat if you like. If something comes to you as you hear Zoe answer the first couple, now the first three, thank you, Ross. We'll be able to take them on. All right, so the first question we got comes from Charles Fout. Charles says, I think you described Polybius and Josephus as historians who wrote about the winners from the perspective of the privileged loser, individuals who were conquered but then became part of the Roman inner circle. Are there any modern examples of historians from a defeated people who have similarly used their insider-outsider status to rewrite the history of a modern conqueror?
Huh. Wow, that's a great question. I don't really know. I'm not that conversant with modern history, so I don't know that I'd be able to think of it. Really interesting idea, though. I mean, it would be good to try to look into that and see. Um, I was talking to Noah before the lecture about other historians, ancient historians, who could be considered sort of on the losing side. And Thucydides was one I was going to make a case for, but I don't think I know of any modern ones offhand. I mean, I'd have to look that up, but that's an interesting idea.
Thanks, Zoe. The next question came from John Lockhart. John asks, well, first a statement. I understand easily that there can be bias in the accounts of the winners, which might tend to glorify themselves and paint their victories as inevitable. But isn't there just as much potential bias from the losers, seeing their loss as inevitable, maybe even divinely dictated, and overly crediting their conquerors for their strength? How do we interpolate these to find a truth?
Yeah, I mean that's certainly a good observation. I mean, again, both Polybius and Josephus are at pains to present their countrymen as, not weak. I mean, they might be arrogant or sacrilegious, but they're presented as brave, as strong, as a good opponent, right? They put up a good fight and they caused the Romans lots of difficulty in their battles, and were a challenge, right? Um, but they also as you said, sort of preface this with, and they were doomed to fail. um, and so in some ways, yes, it gives them an out because, if they can present their countrymen as, making this valiant effort, even though it was impossible for them to win. And how could they succeed against this overwhelming force, right? So it's sort of an excuse on the side of the losers too, uh, that they had no way of, conquering in this way because the outcome was overwhelming. But they also want to present themselves as not pushovers, right? That it wasn't so easy that the Romans could just come in and steamroll them, because then you don't have that claim to being the great history, right? I mean, just both Polybius and Josephus talk about. I didn't give the Polybius quotes, but he talks about this as the greatest disaster that ever befell the Greeks, and as part of this great conflict, Josephus talks about the war as being the greatest conflict between two nations that the world had seen, right? I mean, these are typical historical, you know, uh, hyperbole at the beginning of their works. But, if you're going to make a case that these were great conflicts, you have to have sort of great groups on either side, right? It can't be completely one-sided. Um, so it becomes sort of tricky as far as how we're going to use that excuse. And I mean, again, a lot of the way that you can read both of these historians, especially when they're praising the Romans for some things, is that a lot of it's sort of backhanded compliments, right? So like the Josephus trying to praise Titus for clementia, right? That was like a standard virtue of the emperors by then, that they were supposed to celebrate the fact that the Romans were forgiving of their, they took care of their enemies, and they, were kind to the conquered, forgiving to the conquered. When clearly they weren't. I mean, they clearly were not kind to the conquered. And so the fact that Josephus sort of picks on that one to try to put out might be him, again, exposing this hypocrisy in a way that he can plausibly say, well, no, I was praising the emperor. I was praising Titus, and for something that he's supposed to be praised for, when really he's sort of showing that, no, he wasn't having clementia as a characteristic. So there's a little bit of that, backhanded compliments kind of thing going on with both of these guys, I think.
Mhm. Thanks, Zoe. The next question comes from Ross Bagby. Uh, the question is, did Josephus's reputation suffer when the Flavians were succeeded by the Antonines like Trajan?
Not really. They were all sort of all in the same group. So that string of emperors was all sort of, they all got along with each other pretty well. Um, and apparently Domitian's reign didn't really mess people up too badly. They sort of took him as an anomaly, and things to do with Vespasian and Trajan, they were still held in honor. It was just this Domitian who was sort of dissed. And since Josephus was tied most tightly to Vespasian and Titus, and not to Domitian, he didn't seem to suffer by any sort of, you know uh, his reputation didn't get stuck along with the missions and go down with that ship. So
Thanks, Zoe. The next question comes from someone whose tag is NKIMI. Not sure how to divide that up. The question is there other corroborating evidence that the Second Temple could have been saved in 70 CE if the Hebrews had not used the temple as a fortress?
well, hard to say. I mean, they really didn't have a whole lot of choice about using it as a fortress because they were sort of getting backed up further and further to the top of Jerusalem. So I don't know that they had much choice in the matter. Um, and again, the whole business of the burning down of the temple is presented as out of Titus's control by Josephus. He says that, a random soldier decides to throw, fire into the temple, and it starts burning. And by the time people realize this, it's too late to do anything to stop it. Um, but again, that's, first of all, if Titus had actually given orders that they weren't supposed to burn the temple, that's insubordination. There were a whole lot of valuable things in the temple, so did they loot them first? Did they, a lot of these valuables ended up in Titus's triumph back in Jerusalem. So the whole story is sort of sketchy. I think that given that the rebels were so holed up in Jerusalem. I mean, they were building very series of walls around smaller and smaller areas. I don't know that there would have been any kind of option for them not to use the temple area as part of their fortifications. It had big walls and areas that were very conducive to that. Sort of the way that the Acropolis in Athens ended up getting used as a munitions depot by the Turks. It's one of these kind of things where when your whole city's up on an Acropolis, that's sort of what happens. So I don't know that it could have been avoided. And, there's a lot of doubt about whether, you know, Titus's intention was to burn the temple down from the get-go. It's sort of the kind of things that the Romans tended not to burn temples if they could help it. But in this case, it might have been something that, they thought was necessary. So I don't know if that's a solid answer, but
Thanks, Zoe. The next question comes from another Eisenman, Nina Eisenman. The
I mean,
question is, there are two questions. Did Polybius and Josephus have multiple texts? And if so, how did their descriptions of the Romans evolve? For example, did their view of the Romans become more favorable over time?
so they did have multiple texts. For Polybius, we have only very little of his left. So it's really hard to say. He wrote 40 books of history, of which we have sort of five intact, and everything else is piles of fragments. So with him, it's harder to say. And he wrote a bunch of other things as well that we don't have extant. So it's hard to see if his views changed. I would say that when you look at the beginning of his history and then look at the end, when he's talking about the lead up to the Carthaginian Wars, he does seem to be more favorable to the Romans in that earlier period than he is later on. He seems to think that there's been a decline. He points up Scipio as sort of being exceptional in a certain way, that other Romans were not living up to these standards by the time we get to his contemporary situation. So I do think there was a change there. Josephus, that one I'm not sure I could speak to. We have a bunch of his other writings. We have his autobiography, and then he's got a book called The Antiquities of the Jews, which is basically a history of the whole world, focused on the Jews, starting at the creation and going down to his own times. But I don't know that those talk about the Romans that much. His autobiography does to a certain extent, but yeah, I'd have to go in and compare. I didn't really do a comparison with that text to see.
Nina just asked a related question, so I'm going to bring this one up now. The question is it known if Polybius's writings were used for diplomatic purposes during his lifetime?
I don't think so. Again, I mean, I think for both of these historians, um, they explicitly say they're trying to educate people, right? They say they want people to learn from their experience. Their whole argument, which is a very Thucydidean one, is, it's better to learn from history and other people's experiences than through the school of hard knocks and through your own mistakes, right? So if you can learn from history, you can avoid making bad mistakes. And Polybius is very explicit about that. Um, so I think he was hoping that the Greeks would read his works and take his advice and learn how to deal with the Romans by using that. I think he's also hoping that the Romans, like these people around Scipio and these other upper class Romans, would also take his advice, right? Scipio used him as an advisor throughout his whole career, um, to maybe change their ways a little bit, or think about how they're dealing with their enemies. There's really not a lot of evidence that people did that. As far as we can tell, most of Polybius's influence came later, at the very end of the Republic. And like I said, Livy used him extensively, and a lot of his thoughts about how the Republic, Polybius had this whole theory about how the Republic was going to decline and end. And Livy seemed to have latched onto that, and also used his accounts of the wars and things. But that seems to be where Polybius had his most of his influence on the Romans.
Thanks, Zoe. The next question is from Marianne Schiavone. In general, was it rigorous military discipline and political leaders' avoidance of moral corruption, like bribes, that led to Rome's continual success? I take it this is an invitation to you to assess Josephus and Polybius's explanations of the success of the Romans.
Well, and again, the military might is hard to argue with, because the Romans they really did build a machine, and Polybius when Polybius is writing the armies, it's just starting to be in the field all the time, lots of legions. It's still made up of Roman citizens at that point. So Polybius puts much more emphasis on the sort of cultural aspects that encourage the army to be strong and unified and resilient and brave. By the time we get to Josephus, these are recruits. They're not, they're being paid. They're not necessarily Roman citizens. They get citizenship after they get out of the army. But the discipline and the organization is consistent throughout, right? So most other city-states, empires, nations, whoever, people didn't keep standing armies lying around. When they needed to have a battle, have an army to fight a war, they would recruit people from their countrysides or whatever, and people would get a grandpa's shield and sword or whatever and go, you know, to the recruiting place and become the army. Most of these city states did not have, trained soldiers who that was their job. And that makes a big difference when you're fighting. The Romans also, again, as they grew, as their empire expanded, they had more and more resources to draw on, right? So they have supply lines, they have sources for food and arms and other equipment that people who are in a smaller area or relying on other allies, maybe can be cut off from. So those kinds of resources also, I think, make a big difference to the Roman army. Even when you get, like, again, under Josephus, under the emperors, the government was run by one guy, and that one guy could be a crazy person, but the army seemed to keep going no matter what the emperors did. So,
Thanks, Zoe. The next question has come in from Rich Bisk. The question is, were there any large military battles during this period, or was it more guerrilla-like fighting?
no, there were lots of large battles. So the war in Judea, it had a bunch of guerrilla fighting, and that's what the Jews were really good at. But there were a bunch of set battles as well, especially at the beginning of the war. And the Romans were dealing with, large military battles elsewhere as well, even during this time period. So they were fighting wars up in Germany, they were fighting wars in Spain, in Asia. Um, there was always the risk that the Parthians would start getting involved. So they had, standing armies in Syria. There was infighting in Asia Minor, things like that. So yeah, there were major battles going on during this time as well.
Thanks. And does that apply? I assume that applies also to the period that the Polybius
Oh,
is writing about.
yeah, Polybius, I mean, for Polybius, they were fighting a major war in Spain. They just conquered Carthage in the Third Punic War. So that was a war that was giant set battles. I mean, that was, elephants and ballistas and all the big things going on. And even the Greek wars were, the wars against Macedon too. Part of Polybius's argument against the phalanx is the problem with the phalanx is it's only really useful in set battles, right? You need a nice big flat area to get your guys all together and run at the other army, and that if you have to do any kind of guerrilla warfare, it's useless. So that most of the Greek incited battles were big battles.
Thanks, Zoe. Rebecca asks, how do these histories differ from those of insiders?
Yeah, it's sort of tricky because the difference between, say, Josephus and Livy um, is probably the most. I mean, it's hard to describe Livy as an insider either because he was just a historian. He wasn't a politician. He wasn't a military commander. He was just a Roman guy who was a historian who wrote Roman histories. And we don't have a lot of the contemporary histories, so it's harder to match them up. But Livy was very patriotic, right? So even as he's worried about Rome and worried about the ending of the Republic and the decline of Roman morals and things like that, he still has this vision of Rome as, the inevitable ruler of the world, that Rome is obviously the best of all countries, it's favored by the gods, all these very positive things, and that the real Roman values, real Roman virtues, right, are piety and, uh, not being interested in money, right? We live very simple lives. We're very, direct, and we don't like backstab people or do sneaky things. I mean, he's got a whole list of things that he says are not Roman, that the Romans don't do. Whereas for like Josephus and Polybius, they may say in some places overtly that the Romans don't do these things, but then they show lots of examples of the Romans doing those things. So, setting people up to traitor them, or promising things and then reneging on their promise and things like that. So, I think that's probably a place where there's a difference in the attitudes. People like Tacitus, it's harder because Tacitus is critiquing, he's coming from a Roman senator perspective, talking about emperors and imperial problems. And so he's got a lot of critiques of the regime, and is not as favorable toward the Roman regime. But he's also not thinking about the provinces as being places that he should care about or think about. So those aren't issues he's concerned with. So it's harder to compare there, I think.
Thanks, Zoe. Our next question is from Ross Bagby. Ross asked, so when Gustavus Adolphus revived the standing army, were Polybius and Josephus studied more by early moderns? And of course, as we all know, Adolphus's reign was from 1611 to 1632, something we completely don't have to look up on the front of the question. Just figured I'd throw that out there in case, it slipped your
Yeah,
mind.
it's good to know. Thanks, Noah.
Yeah.
Yeah, not knowing a whole lot about Gustavus Adolphus. But yeah, I mean, it is interesting that Polybius was thought of as like a, you know, a manual for how to deal with armies and things like that. I mean, that's one of the reasons why those books survived, was because, I mean, most of book six is lost, but the parts that are left are the ones that describe his whole rundown of the Roman political system and his whole rundown of the Roman army and how the camp looked. I mean, he's got everything, all the details laid out. You can draw a nice picture from it, and people use that to say, this is how we should run our armies and this is how we should deal with our camps and things like that. So he does have a legacy that way into modern times, or more modern times.
Okay, that is the end of our written questions. Um, tempted to ask one of my own. I mean, I wonder, just reflecting broadly, Zoe. So you started with this interesting thesis. Here's an example of two prominent histories told by the losers, which seems to undermine at least the reflexive credibility that we might give to the old adage that history is written by the winners. So I wonder if there's anything general to be said about the how we could explain the survival of these two histories or their relative prominence in the near term and in the longer term. You just said something about this. You've been saying little bits and pieces about this. Is there any way to compare them to, say, insider histories? You mentioned Livy to me before the lecture began. Anything general to say about how you explain the survival of these history by the losers relative to the, survival of history by the winners that might have been contemporary or roughly contemporary?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, because I'm not sure that there's a real strong answer there. I mean, I think some of the answer is they're well written and exciting. They're talking about, a lot of things that are some of the early Roman histories, especially the annalistic histories, are just lists of, okay, we had these consuls and these things happened and there was a portent and lightning hit the temple and on to the next year. I mean, they're just really dry and boring. And both Polybius and Josephus are good storytellers. And, they're following in this Hellenistic tradition, which was then, becoming very popular. The Greek literary styles and traditions got taken up by the Romans and became sort of the foundations for their own creations, in the late Republic, and by the early Empire, that was sort of the prominent way to go, right? You're always thinking back to the Greek models. So I do think that has something to do with it. And the fact that they're both written in Greek, that contributes to that. Um, I think again, Polybius is very practical. He's got a lot of good advice about how to lead armies and what you should do. I mean, down to measure your ladders before you put them up against a wall, kind of thing. So I think people did find him helpful. And certainly, in terms of the Romans' perceptions of themselves, they're not saying anything so overt that it was problematic, right? So they're favorable enough to Roman self-image or whatever that the Romans are not going to go, oh, these people are slamming us or they're criticizing us. It was either disguised well enough or it's sincere enough that the Romans felt that these are still valuable to us and we can still use them.
Mhm.
I mean, Josephus has a whole other career as you know, to do with biblical stuff, which I don't really know much about. But he's one of the main sources for early Christianity. And for that period of Judaism as well. So that also factors into his survival considerably. And so, you know, Christians were copying his works because he talks about, Herod and Jesus and things like that.
Mhm.
Um, and factored into their intentions and their program of what they wanted to remember and talk about from that time. So that certainly helped Josephus to get translated and keep the text and get
Mhm.
perpetuated that way.
Mhm.
Um, so and again for Polybius with 40 books, we like I said we only have five really intact. The rest of them are we have epitomes, we have quotes, we have fragments, but so while he was fair, as historians go, he was pretty ancient historians go. That's still pretty successful.
Yeah.
It's not it's not like we have his complete works and everybody kept reading them. So
I'm hearing a possible like expansion of history is written by the winners. It's written by the losers, so long as they appeal to some extent to the past winners, the present winners, the future winners. That helps. But
yeah, and again, I mean, I think the theme of decline and fall is always very popular. The Roman historians were always concerned about that, and so since both Josephus and Polybius sort of think about the idea that okay, what's going to happen? When this empire gets so big, is it going to be doomed to fall? I think a lot of later historians were also intrigued by that idea and sort of were following up on those concerns. So it echoed a concern that they had about their own times. So
Mhm.
that's part of it too.
Thanks, Zoe. Well, I'm going to seize on your remark that one of the reasons these histories survived is that they're well written and exciting. Just to say in closing to everyone present, if you have not already registered for Zoe's summer course on Josephus's Summer War, registration closes on June 9th. I'm sure this lecture will have persuaded those of you who are able to register to do so. We're going to end with what has become a basic program tradition. I'm going to ask you all in a moment to unmute and we can applaud Zoe and thank her and congratulate her on the lecture as if we were all in a single auditorium together. So here we go. Please join me in applauding Zoe.
Yay!
Yay!
Great
Go
job,
Zoe!
Zoe.
Very
Great
well
job,
done.
Zoe.
Thank
Well
you.
done.
Zoe.
Well done. Very interesting.
All right.